So first of all, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Angela Kennedy, who's one of our associate consultants who's joined us quite recently. And Angela's going to be talking about a trauma-informed approach to tackling the impacts of adverse childhood experiences and trauma, which students and staff as well may have experienced. So Angela is a consultant clinical psychologist with over 30 years experience in health at the NHS. And she's been at the forefront of developing trauma-informed services and approaches in the UK. And Angela will tell you a little bit about it, but one of our innovative projects we're working on at the moment is supporting Aberystwyth University in taking a trauma-informed approach to service and policy development. So, and we'll come back to Anne and Kate in a moment. So, Angela, over to you. Thank you very much.
So when we often think about trauma, we often think about pushing it into a therapy room. That's what used to happen if you were lucky to get access to therapy. And as a trauma therapist, what I was seeing is that it was kind of like hot potato, okay, there you go, over to you, and that's going to fix it. The problem is it doesn't fix it because these things are contextual. That if you are looking at people in their context, which is essentially what a trauma-informed approach is, you have to see the whole of that context, and that means all of the services, the wider community around it. And so it's essentially a systemic approach. It isn't about just directing people to trauma specialist services, although that can be helpful. It's a systemic approach to thinking about what people need, and it's based primarily on the way that we co-regulate ourselves through our relationships. So how do we create socially safe spaces? So all of the other work that Sumta's already been doing around the sexual violence protection. So they are all kind of ingredients within a wider trauma-informed framework. And about, I think it's four years ago, I brought together about 100 people from various sectors across the UK. So it was from health, justice, prisons, education, there was researchers, there was a lot of people from lived experience, this third sector. They all came together with their good practice examples, and I developed a methodology for extracting themes from those good practice examples, kind of a rapid thematic analysis where it was co-produced, and the themes from those good practice examples around the enabling factors fell out to be these things. And so this became an implementation framework for trauma-informed care. There's three broader domains, as you can see. One of them is about attention to the relationships, one of them is about the way things are set up and what you're delivering, and the other one is about the process, so the way that you do things. You can see within that there's a focus on the kind of leadership. There's a particular kind of leadership that really makes a difference here. So it's collective, it's transformational, and it's compassionate and embodies that moral courage. There's another aspect about relational reparation. Now this one was a hard one to put into words, I have to say, but it's not just about being nice to people. It's actually about realising that as humans we are going to disagree, we are going to fall out, we are going to come from different positions, but how you maintain connections and reach out to people in spite of those disagreements, and a space where all people's narratives are held with some equity is really vital. In terms of the process issues, these ones often come out in trauma-informed narratives. So there's one about safety, so it's psychological, social and physical safety, and that sometimes those conflict with each other. So I've been doing some other work around inpatient wards. You know, physical safety and the psychological safety often aren't easy kind of bedfellows. There's a really tricky domain there, and this is what makes this systemic and iterative. You can't say, well, this is the answer. It has to be built around attunement and people's needs and the unique experiences, and that's what's a challenge. You can't just say, right, you have to do this and then you're trauma informed. It's so much about that, navigating through and tolerating the uncertainties and the conflicts that you come across. There's a big issue about empowerment. generally, trauma and disadvantage does disempower people, and it's one of the core aspects of trauma. But, you know, again, this applies to staff as well as patients. What we know is that staff who have autonomy over their roles, meaning and purpose and connectedness, they are the ones that perform well in their jobs, and they then create cultures for other people to flourish. So all of these domains apply to staff and patients, residents and staff. It doesn't really matter, there is no boundary. We deliberately didn't put in a separate staff wellbeing one because it's embedded throughout the whole thing. This is systemic. There was something else about language, and this isn't just about any challenge to a medical model and diagnosis, which is how sometimes in health it's been interpreted, because diagnosis can often be very helpful for helping people to name and access, name their problems and access services. This is about using less stigmatizing language, a language that is not jargonized, so everybody can be heard and take part in the conversation. What we often have within this field is a lot of experts using a lot of terminology that doesn't really make sense to people with lived experience. And if we're placing lived experience narratives at the forefront, we need to find ways of capturing our academic and theoretical concepts in ways that make sense and are engaged with and are meaningful to people with lived experience. The second thing is about the way things are set up. The healing interventions can be about having specialist therapy services, but it's also the way that you collectively make our buildings healthy places to be in, that there's places to cycle to work. It's that kind of whole embodied way of everything that you have offering there. And then it's the way that things fit together. What we often find is that a lot of services are commissioned just to do that one little bit, and they don't all fit together, in spite of having, whatever new commissioning is around at the moment with integrated in its title. How far are we really towards looking at the piecemeal bits of our services for people's well-being, where they all fit together so people don't fall through the gaps? And you really genuinely have no wrong door. So the evidence base for this in the UK, this has been much more researched and implemented in some other countries than ours. In the UK it's still new. What we have is really no national policy, so we have it mentioned in a few policies now in the last few years, but really no national guidance. And so what you then find is that when it's starting to be implemented, it's little bits of piecemeal bottom-up projects that usually don't have much evaluation attached to it. So the plea from this big NIHR study of what has found is that yes, it looks like it's going to be helpful. We are not entirely sure how helpful and in what areas, and that there is an absence of an evidence base, and that if you are going to do anything, even if it's really small, can you please build in some kind of impact, including any unintended impact that might not be so positive. Because if we are going to be trauma informed, we need to make sure that we are not inadvertently causing more harm. So it's a really good study. It's at Bristol and it's still developing things. So yes, you can see there in terms of, yes, we know this was a kind of more in primary care, but it was a cross-sector look at the evidence base. You can see that there is kind of emerging evidence, but we need to get much better at capturing it, because trauma-informed care, now everybody feels like they have to do it, but are they doing it well? Are they doing it in a way that's really making a positive difference and worth the investment? And how many places are taking a systemic and a robust learning culture approach to that? So Aberystwyth is trying to take a learning culture approach to that. And what they're starting with is, well, how are they going to market their approach? So they are very lucky that being placed in Wales, they've got this fantastic resource from central government around their ACES hub. So how do they market that in such a way to get engagement with staff in the university so that it can become a whole system place? How do you use language and lived experience from staff as well as students to create healthier conversations about what it means to be well and how we stop things traumatising us, whether that be work-related or anything to do with the practice in the university, never mind the things that we bring from outside? How does that then link in with people's motivation? Where are the potential quick wins in the university? How can you engage in movement? Trauma-informed care as a system needs more than just project management. It also needs that kind of hearts and mind approach. So how do you get everyone on board? And then finally, what's your roadmap for change? Not just your vision, but how are you actually going to get there and how are you going to monitor it as you go along? And a lot of that is going to be about building networks for change around certain touch points that really help things to develop. And as you can see, this uses much more of a kind of systems innovation methodology than it might be using a completely straightforward project management approach, which kind of fits with the trauma-informed philosophy a bit more. So that's the project as we're up to. We're really just at the early stages. Oh, and another one.
Yeah, you had another.
Yes. sorry. In terms of student mental health, that's right. So this term resilience is often bandied around in terms of mental health, and it's pushed into the individual, and our services push that into the individual. So the individual has a problem that they go for help for. Well, actually what resilience means is that you are in a context that supports your mental health. So how can we think about the systems and relationship that support that? Because actually trauma doesn't just traumatize, it actually helps us grow. And often the people with who are carrying a lot of trauma are very motivated. They can face the difficult side of human nature in a way that people who haven't got that trauma can't always do. We need to think about what the best practice is in this. And for the, we are all kind of slightly older on the whole here, but that younger generation uses social media for good and for ill. And how do we engage them to know how to use a trauma-informed approach, given that social media is dominating their messaging? And they're the ones that need to teach us about that, because we can't do that. I don't really know how it works well enough. And then the other bit is from the inside out. What are the identities of people? We know that if you make trauma a core bit of your identity, it becomes more problematic. So there's kind of slight issues with kind of people owning their lived experience when it then comes to really identify them. And then there's the other issues around, well, what is actually considered in terms of sexual relationships and things that I think might be some touch points as well. I am done now.
Thank you very much, Angela. That's really interesting. So we'll hold questions until we hear from our next speakers about some of the other projects that we're working on, which is on restorative and educational practices within student services, student misconduct processes rather. So I'd like to introduce two colleagues, Anne Partington from the University of Nottingham, who's Strategic Policy Lead for Student and Campus Life. And Anne's involved in the development of the university's student discipline processes, and we're working with Anne in this project. And my colleague, Kay Renfrew, who's one of SUM's associate consultants and has worked with me on a lot of the sexual violence work that we've done over the years, and he and I have worked together for 25 years now, so lots of different research projects in higher education. So over to you first of all, Anne. Yeah, that's the first one.
Thanks, Helen. So just to give a little bit of context really to the project that we're doing at Nottingham and working with SUMS on, we've put some resources into really thinking about our student discipline process and how that works, and I can see some nods already. And actually a couple of years ago commissioned SUMS to do a review of our student code of discipline, which really set a strategic direction for us to think about how we might modernise that and develop it. And there's some real parallels with what's kind of been talked about already in terms terms of students can tell us quite a lot about how things might have changed, particularly in relation to those issues of consent and sexual misconduct. You know, life's different for them certainly than it was when I was at university. We know in this sector we've probably taken quite an adversarial, and you know, there's lots of talk about criminal justice drift within the sector about how we manage student misconduct. So I've been lucky enough to be seconded into a post where I can really take some time out to look at that, and I'm taking some time to look at how other universities do it, what best practice in the sector is, and things like that. So I'd be really interested in any links within the room today in terms of understanding how it works in your institutions, but also kind of sharing knowledge and good practice. So that review kind of gave us, you know, a bit of a strategic direction to really think about, but also we were looking at the broader context. So we know we're still waiting for the Office for Students consultation outcomes in relation to harassment and sexual misconduct. We know there's lots of work in the sector in this area and lots of developing good practice, again, particularly in relation to sexual misconduct, but also kind of across the board. We also know, again, similarities. We're trying to develop a culture where actually it's okay to come forward and say that things are going wrong, or you've got an allegation or a concern. We're starting to think about how we might publish that without damaging the university reputation, that we can be upfront and honest about. We know things sometimes happen, but this is how we deal with it, and this is how we want to manage it. So a big part of my work has been focusing on the student experience, both for reporting and responding students within that process, acknowledging it's a really difficult kind of process for both of those students, and they're both absolutely entitled to support and you know, a robust and fair process that really supports them. And within that, you know, we've been very much looking at sanctions because historically, and I guess Nottingham isn't alone here, we've we've relied on the use of fines, suspensions, exclusions, and that kind of response to student discipline. I'm not sure we've got evidence that that works and that changes behaviours, and so this very much comes from a place where we're an education establishment. Surely what we want is to educate students and to change behaviours, and you know, be able for students to then stop certain behaviours and move into society, you know, as a kind of, you know, fully rounded individual who's able to build those positive relationships and, you know, kind of like, you know, be a positive adult within our communities. So it's really exciting. So first of all, I think it's just really exciting that, you know, within the whole context of today's conference around the university as the future, we're actually looking at student experience and how we might change that student experience in our universities of the future. And it's really exciting to be doing this project with SUMS, because so I started talking about restorative practices and restorative justice and thought I might be able to implement some things, you know, in a very naive way. I thought I might be able to make changes. And as soon as you start talking about this subject, you realise, number one, how massive it is. And again, it's a little bit like the trauma-informed approach. You can't do a little bit of it. You can't, you know, we were thinking about the end of the discipline process and sitting two people together and having a mediated conversation. You can't do that if the language is wrong, if the policy's wrong, if the whole context and culture isn't supporting restorative conversations throughout all of our kind of work. So it became very clear very quickly that this was a much bigger conversation. And then also what's become very clear is that people who are working in this field, both in the UK but also further abroad, the same names keep coming up, and actually it's the hearts and minds bit where there is a real kind of motivation to do things differently and to do things in a real understanding the harm and putting it right, rather than, you know, that adversarial fines and suspensions kind of approach. So it's an incredibly exciting project. Clearly, you know, intended outcomes are about developing that culture where we're able to talk about things, we're able to have some of those challenging conversations, we can change behaviours, we can improve the student experience, and we can really think about the impact for both reporting and responding students in relation to their educational outcomes, but also more broad outcomes as well. So that's the trigger for the project, and we're sort of halfway through it at the minute. So the information that Kay's going to share is very much our initial findings. They've been talking to a huge amount of people, and we're doing a literature review as well. So it is incredibly exciting. So Kay's going to talk you through some of the findings so far.
Thank you. So this is very much just for an overview for context. So this is the research framework that we are working to. It's, I guess, what you would expect to find, but it's just to give you an idea. So we're looking at advantages, benefits, constraints, and then the priorities and opportunities for Nottingham to start taking this approach. So before we go any further, I'll just sort of give a very brief overview of what restorative justice is. And to say I'm not a restorative justice expert or practitioner, but we're really looking at how other organisations in higher education and beyond use this approach, and so how Nottingham could then start to implement it. And then that quote is from one of the creators of the first one of the first restorative justice programs in the US, with my highlights in bold. And I think what it shows, and the bullets underneath, is that it's very much a shift away from the student discipline based around sanctions and policy violations, and it moved into approaches based around responsibility, accountability, collaboration, which is very important, and changing behaviours, and then addressing the harm that's been caused and rebuilding trust, which is something that often is missing from that adversarial approach. And I think it's very much in tune with the trauma-informed approach that Angela was speaking of earlier. It's preventing harm and it's promoting recovery. So just to say what the drivers for change, not so Anne spoke about it from Nottingham's perspective, and these are very high level, but they're broadly the main drivers for other institutions within higher education that have taken this approach. And so it's summarised as external factors, and this has often been, there's been a move to adopt a restorative approach after traditional disciplinary approaches have failed or they're deemed to have failed, and that's particularly in response to a serious incident, so sexual misconduct. And that's been the case even in the US, where they've got a longer history of taking this approach. But then there's the internal drivers, which I think Anne described very well. But it's also because it's in tune with that mission of higher education institutions to turn out educated people. And one person we spoke to described their motivation for trying to implement this type of approach is because they want to turn students into independent learners who are able to critically transform themselves and the world. So the restorative and educative approaches help individuals to grow and learn from their mistakes, and I think importantly they give all parties a voice in the outcomes. So a few bullet points there. But so what's the scope? One of the things is because student misconduct or non-academic student misconduct covers a broad range from seemingly very minor to what could be crimes. And our research is suggesting that there's no aspect of misconduct that is potentially outside the scope of a restorative approach. In fact, the more serious cases, so sexual misconduct and racial and other types of forms of harassment, they may actually benefit the most from this approach because it's dealing with harm and accountability, responsibility and changing behaviours. But the proviso here is that these most serious cases, they must be handled by experienced practitioners with knowledge about restorative approaches, but also handling these types of misconduct. And it's also, I think, important to note that restorative approaches are part of a range of options. It doesn't replace the traditional disciplinary approach. It may often precede them. And it's very much based on a case-by-case decision, and it's based around the parties involved. The most typical areas that it is used are in student conduct, residential life, and orientation, so student induction. And it offers a different approach that's educational for the person or the party causing harm, while also meeting the needs of the harm party and the institution. So I think the community aspect of it is very important. So what we find about what the preconditions of success. So these are the aspects that are among what needs to be in place to successfully implement a restorative approach. And this is talking to larger universities in the US and New Zealand where this type of approach is more embedded. I guess with all, it's like all change programs, you need to obtain buy-in, and that's at senior level, but not just at senior level. It needs to be across the community. There's a need to raise awareness across the institution from the outset, and that is getting people to understand the philosophy behind restorative approaches. And communication is key. And then we've listed a range of stakeholders that it's important to walk alongside, because co-production is emerging as a very important aspect of this type of approach. It's not exhaustive, and different institutions will probably have different people that they want to add to that list, but just to give an outline. So institutions, solicitors or legal advisors, because obviously they need to understand the process and they need to be able to advise on any legal implications. Academics in this subject area, because this I think is very important, we find, because it gives legitimacy to the approach, particularly within a higher education setting. But they're also a source, of course, of in-house knowledge and expertise, and they can act as advocates, they can communicate, and they can raise awareness. Obviously, students' unions and groups, and there should be early engagement. The reason for this might be to reassure them that a restorative approach isn't a soft option, because students, we've been finding from speaking to institutions that already start to take this approach, they can actually want extremely punitive approaches, for actually what could be quite minor misconduct. So it's really working alongside them so that they are behind the philosophy or understand the approach. And again, they can then act as advocates for taking this type of approach forward and embedding it in the thinking. Obviously, external organisations are very much a source of external expertise and around particularly training, because it's unlikely to have expertise in-house to be able to start implementing this type of approach. And then we've also included the police in this list, and I know that one of the institutions we spoke to in the UK who set up or are setting up a clinic, they spoke to the police, and because they're potentially very important consultees and collaborators if the institution is ultimately going to be using this type of approach for those serious cases of misconduct that could constitute a crime. So this is my final slide, and it's talking about what works. So I think it's fair to say, and although this is a proven approach, and as I said, it's been adopted quite widely in the US and in New Zealand. What works is still a work in progress. Or maybe it's better to say that it's adapting to circumstances because the approach itself is flexible. There aren't any blueprints to say this is how to do it. There's more organisational structures. And what we found is the work is often, if not actually always, driven by the passion and the knowledge of one or two people who really want to make a change and really want to see something different. And they could be academics or they could be in the professional services side. But it does, what our research is pointing to is, so far, is the need to have the right people in place who understand the philosophy and the theory behind it, who know the practical aspects of implementing this type of approach, and then also understand the more broader context of handling misconduct. So particularly if you're going to be looking at things like sexual misconduct, you need people who know how to deal with those type of cases. And that can include external partners. As I said before, all the expertise doesn't have to be in-house. And then finally, and my final point is, you need communicators, because communication of this approach is key. And as one consultee that we spoke to, they described the restorative approach as a communication process. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Kay and Anne and Angela as well. And it's really interesting to me that communication and culture, these sorts of terms are coming through really clearly in the need for being able to adopt these more innovative approaches. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So should we start off for anyone who has any questions for Angela, first of all, about the trauma-informed approach to service development?
I can start us off if you like. It's probably for both of you actually. You both talked about inputs of culture, leadership, hearts and minds. It's an innovative thinking, kind of forward-looking approach. Angela, from your knowledge of other sectors and the research from that perspective, what's coming out that will get the HE sector in a position where those hearts, mind, culture, senior leadership might be more on board?
I mean, I have a view. For me, you can't just push this into the students and then have the rest of the university not using this approach and expect that it's going to work.
Yeah.
What we know about how we work as human systems is that if it's in isolation, it isn't going to be kind of as much culturally accepted. So if you're going to do it, it probably needs that to be threaded all the way through, how disciplinary things are woven through for staff as well. And just in terms of the mental health bit, we know that having a complaint against you, having anything that's to do with your professional practice, your potential income, all of those things are are key factors in completed suicides. It's one of the biggest risk factors, certainly in healthcare workers, and I'm guessing it's probably similar. So, this is really preventative stuff as well, and we need to do things differently if we don't want. But you can't just push it into one part and expect that it's going to work and be taken on and adopted if other people in the system are not doing it within their own house.
And is there a sector that's getting there with that?
I wouldn't say no, it's not a sector. What I've noticed is that there are pockets of really good practice in places for a while, and then you get changes of personnel or whatever, and it kind of goes apart. So it's identifying what's keeping that going there, and then trying to do more of that.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think any sector has probably nailed the trauma-informed stuff yet, but there are pockets of really good practice everywhere. You just have to know it.
Yeah. And so from a research perspective, from the
I think it's very similar. Because goes across the institution, and in some of the US universities they're moving this out into how to the staff conflicts or working with them. So and some of those institutions describe themselves as restorative universities. So it's built into everything they do really. But it is, I think, a ripple effect, and it's about slowly getting that message out there and improving the benefits, and they are wide, and then building from there. And I don't think any sector has really sort of pinned this down, although some are more perhaps advanced.
I was just going to say, I think the student voice is really powerful, and I think we need to get better at that feedback loop. So it's really difficult to get feedback from students, particularly who've been through the disciplinary process, because trauma-informed approach, and it's really difficult to keep talking to them about it. But actually, so the students I've spoken to who've been through our current process, it's powerful when you speak to them about how that was and whether behaviours changed and what it meant to them. And so I think that, along with us getting better at the data in terms of students who are going through the process, repeat, impact on educational outcomes, impact on any health outcomes going forward, I think that's a really powerful message for senior leaders as well.
I think it's, for me, this is one methodology, one process for helping that relational repair. If we just get into adversarial positions constantly, if there isn't any of that, then it leaves us as a society really fragmented, and it's not a healthy place to be.
Graham and then Alice.
Yeah, Angela, thanks very much for that. I'm familiar with some of your work on arts-based approaches. I wonder if you could say something more about it, because we tend to sort of worship at the altar of science on this, as a evidence-based and all that sort of stuff. So just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and about techniques and methods that could be used in terms of trauma-informed approaches.
Yes, so I used to have kind of a life in science and therapy and profession, and then I had an art life. As artist and doing some other things, and we really had to keep them pretty separate for a long time. I think over the years that has changed. It's been much more possible to have some interface. Certainly in COVID though, I can't go back to that, because I think, so for me, we've just doing some research around staff's lived experience of suicide. What's the best way of getting those research results out? Well, we've made a documentary. It's not a teachy film in the way that the other films I've made. There's other projects in terms of capturing things, in terms of art. This stuff helps us to heal. That's the way our brains and cultures have always helped bring people together for music. So one of my other colleagues who I just met yesterday, they have an orchestra that brings people together from very disparate cultures that are in opposition to each other, let's say, but they come together through music, not political debate, and that is vitally important for healing and restorative practice, and you can see that in action, but it's through something joyful. So for me, arts can represent our research, it can be the way that we can do the research, but it's also the place that often we can bring people together to help absorb what we know is the best of the evidence through ways. What I've learned over the years is I can present research findings till I'm blue in the face and it doesn't change practice, but I can get people to embody it through something, and then they'll go, okay, that is how that kind of connects up the knowledge base with the lived experience of something different in a different way. So then you get both of those together. That's where you really get the hearts and minds happening in a way that just doesn't happen in any other guise. And I think the more you can do that collectively as well, the easier it becomes.
Yes, thanks, Helen. I'm really interested to follow up with you afterwards if you're about. Great. I guess my view is that this has got to be the way to go, but it really isn't working, going down an ever increasing, more legalistic, more punitive sort of approach, and what you're doing actually separates from the police and the whole judicial system in a really, really helpful way. But how do you persuade people, certainly in my institution, where they're being pushed more and more down the legalistic, we now want everybody represented by barristers at our disciplinary meeting. How do you persuade them that there is a different way and that actually complainants are going to accept this? We find that, they want them undrawn and quartered, they want them publicly vilified. How do you persuade people that that's not either our position or the right way to go about it in an educational context?
I think I possibly need to come back and talk to you in a year's time. Because I don't want to say that we're at that point where we've persuaded people yet. What we've got is a small group of people who have been the working group overseeing the developments of the kind of code of discipline and moving us forward in that way, who are absolutely brought into this, but that we haven't got institutional change yet at all. And actually that's the purpose of kind of commissioning SUMS to do this work. So, that bit about how do we change hearts and minds, how do we get the buy-in for this? I've yet to have that conversation with our VC and our registrar in terms of, really moving forward, and it's how we make that change happen, either bottom up or top down. So, the SUMS research is going to be really important in kind of taking forward that conversation within the university for sure. I do think, and Kay mentioned it earlier, I think there is slight changes in practice in the early intervention kind of field within student discipline. So the way we're managing things before they come formal, within our residential, so we have Res X at the University of Nottingham, there's a lot of restorative practice conversations happening, which hopefully stop the need for some things to go more through a more formal route. So I think we've got that basis to build on there, which is seen as being incredibly positive. The kind of more formal route, and the challenge with whatever comes from the Office for Students in relation to using legal definitions and managing things in that way and having legal representation. I think as a sector, and there's people here who know this way more than I do, there's as a sector we've got some work to do to try and, in my mind personally, challenge some of that and be really clear about what it is we're there to do as an educational institution that doesn't have a criminal justice responsibility. But that's my personal
Couldn't agree more, but I don't know how we influence.
Absolutely.
So I'm really worried what's going to come out pushes us even more down a sort of stronger, if I can use that phrase, route, and we're then going to be regulated and stuck in what is actually a situation that's working. But I'm not involved in any of the OFS discussion, but I haven't found anybody who really is, who knows kind of what they're thinking. We did push back quite hard when the first lot came out and said, hang on a minute, but I'm not convinced.
I think I'm hoping we all pushed back quite hard. I'll sound naive if I say that I am hoping that's why there's a reason for the delay in bringing things out, but that might be an incredibly naive position. But we have started talking, so I've visited a number of universities this week that are doing things slightly differently and, working in a really positive way, getting that university link of all of us. When I put out a call through a Moshi for universities who wanted to be involved in talking about restorative practices, we were overwhelmed. So there is a swell within the sector, which is great, and hopefully, I'm absolutely happy to share the outcomes of the SUMS, kind of work across that network and see if there's stuff we can do together.
Great, thanks. Any other questions? I think.
Rosalind.
Oh, I did have one. Yes, it was a comment as much as anything, linked to the sectoral question. It feels like, as you say, we can't be doing this in isolation, even within our own institutions. It has to be whole institution approaches. But it always strikes me, and one of the really big challenges is obviously we are inheriting people who have come through existing earlier years systems and structures of support, and so we're actually having to undo a lot of behaviours and learning, and I just wonder, is there evidence of these kinds of approaches on both of the topics being seen in earlier education settings, so that I say young people, we know that not all of our students are the classic 18-year-olds, but there is a large number that are. are we seeing evidence of these practices working in earlier years, such that maybe we can hope for almost a better future, that people become equipped and knowledgeable about the expectations and behaviours?
Sorry, as I say, there are in schools restorative approaches being taken, and I think Scotland and Northern Ireland, I think, might be further ahead, certainly than England. But I don't think it's not embedded, but it certainly is starting, to be implemented there and as an approach. So maybe, I don't know, it's 20 years time it might be second nature, but at the moment it's still, I think, quite fragmented.
I think with the trauma-informed approach, if you have a look at she's called the Surgeon General in California, and she's got a documentary called Resilience Film. It's quite old now, but what they've done is they've taken a much more community-based approach to early health, mental health, antisocial behaviour, all of that, working really closely with families in a very non-judgmental way to look at the supports they need in order to contain the worst excesses of some of the behaviours that might be seen as problematic. And that does have a really good evidence base. I'm not really seeing that happening systemically here yet. There's a few conversations happening, so there's some commissioners in one town near me that started to try and look at that, getting that a bit of traction around that, but that's probably the place to go to. And her name went out of my head as I was thinking what it is she called, I can't remember, but she's Surgeon General in California. If you put in trauma-informed approach, it'll come up, and really inspiring stuff about how you do this systemically early on.
Makes me sad for the demise at Sure Start. I was thinking just that.
Any final comments or observations? Yes, please.
Yeah, it's a comment really, and it's more about an opportunity. I think it links back to Ken's point earlier on today. So hi, Natalie Mortimer, I'm an associate consultant, but used to work at Nottingham. So hi, Anne, nice to see you. But just an opportunity about all the work that you're doing, but linking again with that public engagement piece. I do a lot of work with universities in the kind of market opportunity space around, how they can bring some of the applied practice in education through to business and industry and in the education sector. And I was working with a university recently in the southwest who have a big institute of education and are working with that they're actually doing space in the mental health and Senko space for young people. But I can see here there could be opportunities again for that public engagement, public policy, just really information sharing. So it was just an observation and a comment, but I could see how there could be some great link-ups there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that brings us up to the end of our time. I think it must be lunchtime there, but I'm not really sure. But please join me in thanking our speakers.